Today we're here with Dr. David Weinberger, and we're going to be talking about how internet technologies and other things affect the way we think about knowledge and education. So let me intro Dr. Weinberger first, and then we'll start talking about how his ideas apply to the field of education. Dr. David Weinberger is a senior researcher at the Berkman Klein Center. He's been, among other things, a philosophy professor, a journalist, an internet entrepreneur, and a fellow and an advisor to several presidential candidates. He was for 4 years the co-director of the Harvard Library Innovation Lab, focusing on the future of libraries. Dr. Weinberger writes about the effects of technology on ideas. He's author of several books, including Small Pieces Loosely Joined, Everything is Miscellaneous, and his most recent book, which is, I think, where our focus mostly is today, which is called Too Big to Know, Rethinking Knowledge Now That the Facts Aren't the Facts, Experts Are Everywhere, and the Smartest Person in the Room is the Room. Dr. Weinberger, this is an interesting interview because usually when I do interviews, it's with people who've written directly about educational issues. And your book, Too Big to Know, and your other works deal with knowledge, which I guess really does affect education, but you don't really deal directly with education. So for people who aren't familiar with your work, why don't we start with kind of a summary of your work, and particularly the work Too Big to Know, because the subtitle is really provocative: Rethinking Knowledge Now That the Facts Aren't the Facts, Experts Are Everywhere, and the Smartest Person in the Room is the Room. So what do you mean by all this?
Well, the idea behind the book is that knowledge is shaped by its medium. And this is hardly a new idea, that thought is shaped by our media. Certainly Marshall McLuhan in the 1960s is responsible for furthering that idea. And there's been a recent line of thought that I think helps to flesh this out, which I first encountered in a book by Andy Clark called Being There. And it's one of these books that when you read it, you think, oh, well, that's obvious. But then you think, okay, it's obvious, but I'd never thought of it before. I'd never realized it before, which is the best way of being obvious, I think. So in that book, Clark argues that the idea that we think in our heads is wrong. Obviously brains are involved, but so are entire bodies, and most importantly, the world. So his argument is that we think out in the world with things. So if you're a physicist and you're working on a problem, if somebody takes away your whiteboard and your markers, you cannot think. You just can't do your work, your thoughtful work. And likewise, if you are you're a statistician, you cannot do your work without a computer. You could do it very, very badly at pencil and paper, but that's also thinking out in the world. We use tools to think without in the world. And that's, I think, as soon as Clark said this, as soon as I read it, I said, oh, yeah, of course, obviously we do. So that helps explain, I think, why something as mundane as the nature of paper can be responsible for, at least in part, for shaping something as ethereal and important as knowledge. So the book starts from that idea and then wonders what happens, if that's true, then what happens to knowledge when you remove it from paper, when it becomes digital, and most importantly, when it becomes connected. And it turns out lots of things that we in the Western tradition, because the book is only about the West, lots of things in our tradition that we've assumed are just obvious about the nature of knowledge, in fact, are only obvious if you're starting from paper. If paper is the medium for communicating and preserving knowledge. Take away the paper and knowledge changes in really important ways. And a few of those ways are that we have assumed that knowledge is settled. We don't talk about knowing something if we're not sure, or if our culture is still arguing about it, we just don't know. So knowledge is that which is settled, and we've assumed, in the same way that ink settles into paper, right? I don't think it's an accident. Once you've written something down on paper, once you've published it, you cannot take it back. And so knowledge has taken on that unchangeable quality. We've assumed that it is divided up into topics. and the topics are, everybody knows, are not perfect, but they're pretty good. And that maps a little too closely to the limitation of books, that they are only, they're only this big. They're not this big. They're relatively small, and they have a beginning and end. They have covers. That's more or less how topics work. And if we didn't have to publish ideas, knowledge in that form, then maybe the concept of topics and disciplines would change as well, including academic disciplines. I mean, a lot of our education is based around the idea of the world falling into relatively divisible topics, at least divisible enough that you can get a major in them, you can become a professional, and you can be tested in them. And we've also assumed that knowledge is the result of filtering. That's from the very beginning of the idea of knowledge in the West, which was in the ancient Athens, where knowledge was first explicitly distinguished from opinion, because everybody had an opinion, but you had to try to figure out what was the right way of steering the city-state. Well, if knowledge is on paper, then it continues this tradition of being filtered, because paper is expensive. Very few books are published compared to the volume of manuscripts that come in. And so knowledge, we have assumed, is something that is a result of filtration. But you take away paper and those limitations, which also have strengths, but those limitations go away. And so knowledge is right now beginning to change its shape. It is much less settled and incapable. I think we're losing the illusion that we can settle knowledge. I want to be careful. There is such a thing as knowledge and truth, and science gets closer to it in general than anything else we know. But the idea that we can have a sincere, open, honest conversation with anybody, and if everybody is reasonable, bring them to a single truth, we now, I think, see that that's just not the case, which is, in some ways a disaster, but that's the way that it is. It is unfiltered. That is, the filtering happens after publication. So anybody can put whatever they want up on the web, of course. But then we have evolved this very complex and usually pretty efficient system of filters by which we decide what's interesting to us and what we think is worthwhile. So that's filtering, but it's after the fact, not before the fact. And it is, sure, topics continue to exist, but the web is characterized most deeply by being linked, and links transgress boundaries. That's their point, including the boundaries of topics. So you can reimpose topics onto a field, and that's often quite useful, but you're aware that you're imposing something foreign to it, and you're drawing borders that don't actually exist. Sometimes it's useful to do that, but topics are seen less as a structure of knowledge or of the world than they used to.
There was one instance I remember when I was teaching where I was really made aware of this. You talked about how knowledge seems less and less settled. So this was when I was a college professor in an education college, which I am now. And I was in a classroom. I was talking about a particular thing that some researchers had found about kind of a useful education method. I don't remember the details exactly. One of my students said something about, well, I heard in another class kind of a different bit of information. So which one is correct? So we kind of started to think about, okay, which one of these is correct? And the assumption is that one of them has to be correct. So I went home and the students went home and we all kind of researched it online and other places. And what we found out was that people just disagree about which one of these is correct. It's either X or it's Y. And everyone kind of wanted to figure out which of these is correct. And the only conclusion we could come to is it looks like online, we don't know which one is correct. And I have to imagine maybe 60 years ago when the internet really didn't exist and make these kind of disagreements really visible, where the only place you could go to research was, to your library and the journals, it probably wouldn't have looked like people disagreed. But now, of course, it's made glaringly evident.
Yeah, I think that part of the situation is exactly that we can now see the level of disagreement that was pushed beneath the line of visibility drawn by the media. So in the old days, if you read one of the handful of newspapers in your city, and they expressed a really very narrow range of ideas. I mean, the political spectrum of them tended to be quite narrow. it was Democrats and Republicans and fairly moderate versions of each. Other voices were not just marginalized, they were inaudible. You simply couldn't find them often. Now it's gone the other way. So you can hear every crazy voice in the world, and many of them are not crazy. Some of them actually are crazy. And so it's a totally different landscape. It's a different power structure, and it requires a different set of techniques to be taught to, for example, students.
So let me bring this into kind of the realm of education, because one of the things your work makes me think about, if we're talking about knowledge being unsettled, and the internet kind of really gives us a clear picture of how unsettled it often is. One of the things you talk about is kind of the old model of expertise, where there were certain people who kind of were the repository of all the kind of best that's been thought and stuff like that, and knowledge filters kind of through those people. And I think about teachers and professors, because that's kind of the role that teachers and professors, it seems to me, have kind of played with students. Is students come into school or college, and the professor's there, and the professor is the repository of knowledge, and the professor's job is to filter that knowledge to students so that students can learn kind of what the professor knows. It kind of strikes me that with the way your work conceives of the changing nature of knowledge, it seems that the way we teach and learn may have to change.
Yes, I think it's desperately important that the way we teach change. And that's happening to some degree just naturally in response to how students come into classrooms these days, because they've been trained not by the newspapers and not by the encyclopedias. They've been trained by going out onto the net. So their information gathering is very different than it would have been coming into a classroom 20 years ago. I'm very hopeful about this, because part of the reason why the book is called Too Big to Know is that the fundamental premise is that our strategy has been, until now, has been to try to know a universe that is vastly larger than our capacity to know it by engaging in strategies that reduce what there is to know. And one of those strategies is to enable experts as people who know a great deal about a relatively small bit. Sometimes it's comically small, but usually it's not. I like experts, but that's been a fundamental strategy. Now we have, if we use tools to think in the world, the tool that we have now is not just computers. It's a network that connects us and data all in one gigantic mass. And that's an opportunity to vastly increase what it is that we're able to know, where the we is not your head or my head, but is networks of people who are engaged with one another. So a knowledge network at a minimal consists of people who are engaged with one another, iterating on differences. And it's what that network as a whole knows that is, I think, now the measure of knowledge. So we want to build, in my view, smart networks of people who are engaged generally constructively, so that the network itself knows more than the individual. And I just want to be careful when I say knows, I don't mean that it's become conscious in an AI sort of way, but rather it's the connection, the social engagement of the people that is where the knowledge exists.
It's I mean, I guess the other thing that strikes me about it is when I think about, because you do mention network knowledge a lot, that's kind of a core feature of your book. So you talk about things like the ability of crowdsourcing to help really solve problems, because every one of us may know a little bit of something, and we kind of get together and solve these problems in a large scale. So if we're talking about students, it seems to me we want to prepare students to function in that type of world. But when you compare that to classrooms, we often focus on individual work done individually. You take tests individually, you solve problems individually, and the idea is you do things very individually, and then we give you kind of an individual grade. I mean, do you have any thoughts about kind of that method of education where it's really focused on your individual ability to solve problems versus preparing students to go out into these worlds where really a lot of what they'll be doing is this networked knowledge, using networks to solve problems?
Yeah, so on the one hand, of course, you want competent individuals. But it seems to me that the emphasis is wildly wrong at this point. Sort of the implicit message is that we need to make you into a strong, brave knowledge pioneer who's going to head out into the wilderness of knowledge on her own and come back with, the big game or whatever. And nobody works that way. I don't think anybody ever did, but now it's really clear that this is not how we're going to proceed. And it's not, part of it is that we've gotten this idea from the very origins of the web in the early 90s, that the internet is an information resource, that it's a gigantic library, but unlike a real library, there's no curation, so there's stuff in it that's terrible and shouldn't be believed right next to the stuff that is worth believing. And so, sure, it's wonderful, there's so much stuff we keep telling ourselves, so many publications of various sorts, but oh for the old days when responsible adults would dictate what made it into the library, and now we have this uncontrolled library. Well, yes, and yeah, sure. I mean, that's one way of viewing it, but it doesn't explain the cultural importance of the internet. So there's something else that's going on here. It's not that suddenly everybody decided that they really want to become amateur research librarians. They want to go on the net in order to research information. Oh, we go on the net to answer questions, to talk with other people, to explore, to browse, to waste time, to all the different things that we do. It is not, you cannot understand it primarily as a publishing source or a library or a source of ideas and content. It is much more a connection between us. So you go out, if it's anything beyond, when was Hamilton born, some simple fact which you get by typing into Google and it just tells you. If it's anything, I picked a very bad example because I think it's not clear when Hamilton was born. I don't know why I picked that. The worst possible example I could give of a simple fact. If it's anything that's more interesting than that, which is what we want our students to be interested in the world. So they go out and they will, even if it's a review of a cell phone or a video game, or it's a more interesting question, they go out and they're not just reading something, they're tweeting about it or Facebooking it or Instagramming it, and they're getting comments back and they're finding what other people said and following a link or two, we hope, and discovering that there's always more, there's always another link, and that people don't always agree about these things. This is what the internet is best at and what I think it's most important for in education. It's funny because when I teach, both when I taught high school and when I teach college level courses, occasionally I'll be assigned to teach something that I don't really feel terribly fluent in. And one of the things I'll end up doing is spending a lot of time online, whether it's starting with Wikipedia and going from links out there and then following those links out and following those links out. And it always occurs to me, one of the best things I could do as a teacher is instead of doing that myself, I could set up a situation where students actually do that, because it always occurs to me there's no reason students can't be doing what I'm doing right now. They could be doing those following links and contributing to different sources of knowledge and like you said, looking at this conversation. But it always feels like we, as teachers, the inertia is to follow that existing model of I have to be the one to do the research, give it to students, and then they consume it. There's a researcher named Alison Head. I think her group is Project Information Literacy, PIL, who a couple of years ago did some research on college students, all of whom are, it's quite typically, prohibited from using Wikipedia. Go out, professors understand they're going to go out onto the internet, but do not use Wikipedia. And of course, she found that they all do, but they don't cite it, which is, they're not allowed to do. But they use it to do what you just described, which I think she's the one who invented this. I'm not sure, which is pre-search, not research, but pre-search. You need to do a report on the periodic table, and so the first thing that you do is go to Wikipedia. So if you don't know anything about it, you go there and you see what the general, what you need to know, what are the big topics, who has been talking about the periodic table, and then you go out to those links, but you don't mention that you use Wikipedia. Wikipedia is an incredible pre-search tool, and if it's not that, it's something else. And not only is there no shame in using Wikipedia, it's a completely appropriate use of it. Why would you not tell your students not to use this resource that's, I think, is going to be as famous in history as the Gutenberg Press was. It's now way cheaper in terms of time and labor to look at a source and to reject it. That's good. We want that's part of the critical thinking skills. We want students to be able to read something and decide relatively quickly, because life is finite, that no, this is written at a second grade level, it's not going to help, or wow, it sure seems like it's biased, so it's not. You want to let people reject really quickly. That's an important skill for researchers. Now, because everything is a click away, that skill becomes even more important and more beneficial.
So another question I have for you is that, especially in the educational world, a lot of teachers, scholars, writers are kind of concerned about the negative effects of technology, whether it's in the classroom or at home. So you hear a lot of people talk about how technology affects negatively, let's say, short-term and long-term memory, because now we can offload so much to the internet that we kind of come to rely on it. Or there's so many links that we have information overload that it affects how long we can pay attention to stuff. I know you've done some work on that, responding to some of those folks, because you're a little bit more optimistic in terms of what the internet and things like that are kind of doing. They're not necessarily making us stupider, but they're making us more interconnected and actually making the collective intelligence, I guess, smarter, if you will.
This goes back directly to thinking as a process, something we do out in the world with tools. So first of all, the question of whether it's shortening our memory and making it harder for us to fix short-term memories into long ones and follow long chains of reasoning, that's a matter for science. And it's, it's the sciences, as far as I can tell, as a non-scientist, is tending to support that view. It's not unanimous. But Plato/Socrates said exactly the same thing, and he was right. He objected to the new literacy that was coming on two grounds. The first is that you cannot respond. Somebody says something in a book or on a tablet or whatever, you cannot respond. You can't question. That's very true. And the second thing is, he said it would shorten our memories. And that's exactly what happened. Before literacy, the Greeks were memorizing the Iliad. It's a pretty long poem, but people were able to do it. And now we laugh at that. There's no conceivable way. And maybe you have some savant who can do it. But no, we can't memorize long swaths of poetry, thousands of lines. We can't memorize hundreds of lines. So we lost something. And Socrates was completely right about that. But what he didn't account for is the fact that by writing things down, through literacy, overall, the system, that is all of us involved in the system, got smarter. We were able to externalize memory onto paper or clay tablets or whatever, scrolls, whatever we prefer. We're able to externalize memory on tablets because then we are smarter, even though we remember less. I
guess the analogy I usually use in the classroom, because I talk to students about the works of people like Andy Clark and people like that, is it seems like students are more intelligent when they have to memorize a head full of facts, when they have to do things like you said, like memorize the Iliad. It would seem like students are much more intelligent when they have to do that, and now they don't. But if you think about it a little bit differently, what it does is when you have the Iliad on paper and you have all these facts on the internet, that students no longer have to necessarily memorize all of them. They just have to remember how to get to them. What that does is it frees up their brain to do a whole lot of other stuff that it couldn't have done before.
So yes, that's the positive idea, and I certainly promote that idea, because I think it's the idea that needs to be. We hear the negative all the time, and so I think it's worthwhile to point to what I think is at least as deep a positive. It is certainly the case. So I was born in 1950, and during my childhood, education moved away from rote learning, which means I did not memorize a lot of, or basically any, poetry. And I think my life is diminished because of that. We moved away from rote teaching in order to achieve some other educational aims, which I happen to think are more important than my ability to have internalized big chunks of poetry. So I don't regret that. I don't regret that sort of decision that was made for me, but I did lose something by not being able to remember big chunks of stuff. And in the same way, we will lose something. And some of it is a shame to lose, and some of it I think is okay. In fact, is good to lose. And one of the things I think it's good to lose, I'm going to regret saying this, is the focus on long chains of thinking as the ultimate form of knowledge or human intelligence, the high point. It's good to be able to follow long chains of thinking in particular disciplines. It's crucial. Nevertheless, the idea that the world should be understood that the world is constructed in long chains of logic, and that the human project should be to figure out what those long chains are, seems to me to be not even true. I think we are seeing more and more now that our technology enables us to see it, that the world is in fact pretty chaotic. It's not derivable from a simple set of laws with the clock ticking perfectly and the mechanism working predictably. It's really not like that. I suspect that we valorize that way of thinking because that's how books work. Books favor pages that go in order and you'll follow one after another. That's not how the world works, though. Yeah, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, you describe it as, I guess, kind of if you look at the way a book works and you think of that as how knowledge works, it looks very unidirectional. It goes from the second page, the second chapter follows from the first chapter, third from the second. But if you look at the way the internet works and you think of that as how knowledge works, it looks really scattered because everything's hyperlinked to everything else. And in some ways, what that makes me think of is the student who has trouble paying attention to like a longer lecture or whatever. We usually treat that student as kind of there's something wrong with them because they're not learning the way they're supposed to be learning. But maybe in some ways, the way we think you're supposed to be learning is actually a byproduct of the book that follows from chapter 1 to chapter 2, and it is unidirectional versus the way the web is. So maybe that student is actually just learning in a different way that's more like the web than a book.
There's certainly a school of thought that thinks that attention deficit disorder is not a disorder, it's only a disorder in a particular culture, et cetera. That there's virtue in thinking that through. But I'm old-fashioned enough to think that, well, yeah, I mean, there are obviously different learning styles, and there's also different abilities. Forget the internet, there's always been different abilities to attend to something for a long period. Some people are really, really good at it, and they can burrow down into a question for the rest of their lives and become narrow but deep, deep, deep experts in something. In its most positive way, I guess we could say that it's possible that we're seeing a shift from an emphasis on deep learning to an emphasis on wide learning, where I think both are valuable. And I don't think we'll ever lose both. I think the sort of deep, narrowish expert that's a personality trait, and we're not going to lose that. And we would be far worse off if we did lose it. Nevertheless, we now can see a type of wide learning in which many connections among many different pieces, somebody can draw those together, and that's a type of knowledge and even wisdom as well.
Well, this has been a really, really interesting talk, and I think we did a really good job of taking your ideas and kind of thinking about the educational ramifications of them. So I hope the viewers get a lot out of this too. Dr. Weinberger, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.